I was in this very dark, comfortable place where I was like, it was nice and snug and warm. I could hear noises in the background, what sounded like people talking.
We have heard of people having memories of the afterlife after having near-death experiences, but something we hear about a lot less often are memories from before people were even born. From people who vividly remember being in the womb, to people being able to recount their own births, to stories of children telling their parents some strange and creepy memories they have of their pre-birth experience. On today's top 10 list, I'll be covering 10 dark memories of people from the womb. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Andy's story. This story comes from a guy named Andy who apparently has quite a few memories from being in the womb, many of which he describes as traumatic. This memory starts off with his legs snapping out involuntarily. This action causes one of his feet to trap the umbilical cord against one of his mom's bones, which he guesses was the pelvic bone. I just have to say, I know we're talking about Andy's experience right now, but this just sounds incredibly uncomfortable for his mom. The idea of having someone's foot on my pelvic bone is certainly not ideal. Anyway, this situation and the trapping of the umbilical cord led to blood supply from his mom's lungs being cut off to him, which he then remembers rendering him unconscious. This is the end of that memory, but a few details he added are that he can remember his legs being thinner than the umbilical cord, which is pretty crazy, and he also explains that the peak of this memory is coupled with an angry, not again type feeling. Perhaps this was a regular occurrence during Andy's time before birth. In our number 9 spot today, we have Holly's story. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. A woman named Holly explained that she had a pre-birth memory that she didn't even realize was pre-birth until just recently. This memory is a little bit different from others on this list, and it actually comes from before Holly was even conceived and growing in the womb, because, hey, I have to keep you guys on your toes. This started when her family was visiting her mother's hometown. Her mother was showing where her grandparents had lived while she was growing up, and this is when Holly exclaimed, "Yeah, I remember that house. I remember cleaning it out after they passed away and we got that yellow egg slicer thing." The mom responded, confirming that this was an actual event that happened, but then recalled that this happened in 1996. That would be fine, except for the fact that Holly was born in 2001. That is obviously quite a time discrepancy, and how could Holly possibly remember something that she didn't even exist for? Apparently they tried as hard as they could to figure out why Holly knew this information, but neither of them could figure it out. In our number 8 spot today, we have this Bones story. This pre-birth memory comes from when a mom asked her 6-year-old if he remembered being inside his mom's tummy. I'm not necessarily sure what answer she was expecting, but to her surprise, her son answered yes. He explained that he could hear the heartbeat and that he could tell when she was walking fast because the heartbeat would speed up, and also explained that if she was still for too long, he could feel that it was too slow. He also explained that the liquid around him, which he called blood, kept him mostly in place and didn't allow him to move around much. Perhaps the creepiest part of his explanation for me personally is how he explained that if he moved a bit sideways, he could see her thigh bone, and he said he could also see part of her heart, but most of it was blocked by her ribs. Listen, I make YouTube videos and I'm absolutely not a medical professional, so I have absolutely no idea how medically sound any of this is, but that is just what this child says he remembers. This child also apparently saw swirls that had a black center while he was in the womb. He said that he was afraid of them at first, but then he touched them and realized that they were harmless, and eventually they all just disappeared. Honestly, I can't even begin to guess what this could have been, but it certainly is an interesting story. In our number 7 spot today, we have this cave story. This one isn't as much of a story as some of the other ones are, but it is a pretty distinct memory that one mom got from her toddler. When she was 2 to 3 years old, her daughter explained to her mom and dad that being in her mom's belly was scary. She explained it like a dark and squishy caveman cave, and while that doesn't necessarily sound appealing, I feel like it does sound probably pretty accurate. This mom then goes on to explain that her daughter doesn't have the memory anymore and that she doesn't even remember telling her parents this, but the mom says she'll never forget it and that she actually wrote it down in her journal after her daughter had told her because she thought it was just so strange for her to volunteer that information. In our number 6 spot today, we have this senses story. This story starts off with this person explaining that most people don't believe them, but they are sure that they can remember being in the womb. They say that they remember the sound and sights more than any specific one memory. Apparently it sounds like having your head underwater, which makes a lot of sense. They explain that they can remember what was like drifting in and out of consciousness. Apparently this went on for what felt like forever, and then they have a memory shortly after their birth of their parents laying them down in an apartment. After this, their next memory is around 3 years old from a time they were at the beach. I'm not exactly sure if this is a true memory or not, but this person seems very adamant about being able to clearly remember this. And I feel like it all really does make sense, so it just might be true. In our number 5 spot today, we have Dyllon's story. This story comes from someone named Dyllon, and they said, "I don't talk about it because it seems absurd, but I do have one. I was in a dark black environment, and before my eyes were also dark black shapes that looked like people laying on their backs scrolling by me. I was either told or under the impression that this was my family. Then I suddenly remember being conscious and standing in a living room confused as to what was going on, as my friend apparently was running around a table and laughing. I didn't know who I was or what was going on. That is where my life began for me. I was approximately 3 to 4 years old." One thing that I found while researching for this video is that this feeling is actually quite common. There are a lot of people who have these pre-birth memories, and then they can't remember anything else until the age where it's more common to start having memories. I wonder if there's some sort of reason for this correlation. In our number 4 spot today, we have ELLIANDER'S story. This story comes from Elliander, who remembers being in the womb right before birth, and he is also able to remember the birthing experience. He explains seeing a bright light, which was pretty much all he could see, and he remembers the feeling of motion, like when you're not necessarily moving yourself, but you're being carried somewhere by some kind of vehicle. He then remembers opening his eyes and seeing his mother's face, as well as just having this really strong feeling of curiosity, which absolutely seems fair. He said he was looking around but had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. He goes on to explain that he feels like he remembers this all because he was born with an excess of cartilage in his ear that a surgeon fixed right away, and this trauma has stayed with him. He says he remembers it being extremely painful, and while he can't remember the feeling of the pain, he can remember his reaction to the pain and his own crying. I'm sure this was definitely not a nice way to be welcomed into the world, but the good news is he obviously made it through, which is what it's all about. In our number 3 spot today, we have Jill's daughter's story. This story is about a woman named Jill's daughter, who is now a full grown-up in her 30s, but this one comes from when she was around 2.5 years old. She had just really taken notice of her mom's belly button for the first time, which is a very cute image. Jill begins to explain to her daughter why we have belly buttons and how she used to be connected to her through her belly button. This is when her daughter speaks up and says, "Yes, I remember, and it was cold." Jill responded and said, "Well, it definitely shouldn't have been cold." And then her daughter said, "The towel. It was rough and it hurt my skin." Jill said that she just left that conversation there for that day, which I think is a very fair response. I hope her daughter was just talking about something random, because I absolutely do not want to know what towel she was talking about. In our number 2 spot today, we have Aaron's story. This pre-birth story comes from someone named Aaron and is what they remember from their last moments being in the womb, and they also say that they remember their birth. Aaron explains he remembers being angry and hurt and frustrated by the change from the warm womb to the cold world. He also says he remembers the bright lights and feeling extremely confused. An analogy he used to describe it was as if you were sitting in a car which was warm, but it was completely blizzarding outside, and then someone breaks your car window and drags you out. That definitely does not sound ideal. He also explained that it was very abrupt, and the main thing he felt was confusion. Like he had just been taken from this world that he knew and launched into a totally new world. He said, "I felt like I was still underwater, unable to clearly hear what was being said." Honestly, whether Aaron really remembers this or not, this does seem like probably a pretty accurate description of what being born feels like. It's kind of crazy and cool that we all have this collective experience that every person has gone through, but very few of us, if any, can actually remember it. In our number 1 spot today we have this 1950s story. This pre-birth story comes from the 1950s and is actually pretty crazy. This guy can remember being in the womb and being really hungry, so he signals to his mom that he's hungry in whatever way fetuses do that. I would assume some sort of hormone or something, but in all honesty, I have no idea. Regardless, he is expecting some sort of sugar rush or sustenance to come quickly, but it didn't. This resulted in him throwing his arms and hands out like a starfish and him just staying there. He then remembered being hit on the shoulder and could feel the hit reverberating through him and the womb. When he turned 19 years old, he ended up talking to his mom about this memory and asked why he remembers always being hungry in the womb. His mother replied that her doctor had imposed on her that it was pertinent that she stayed pretty throughout her pregnancy for her husband. There's a lot of opinions I have on that, but I'm just going to remember that this was in the 1950s and thankfully not anytime recently, and I'm just gonna hope that no doctor anywhere currently would say something so absurd. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. If you have a pre-birth memory, please let me know down in the comments because that is absolutely wild. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye!